The autumn sun hung low over the barren stretch of Texas prairie, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of Ezra Coleman's modest homestead. For nigh on 7 years, he'd called this desolate patch of earth home, though calling it a home was being mighty generous. The single-room cabin stood crooked against the endless sky, its roof patched with whatever scraps of tin and wood Ezra could scrounge from the occasional supply wagon that rumbled past on the distant trail. Ezra had built this place with his own 2 hands after the war ended, seeking solitude in the vastness of the frontier. At 42, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little about it. His beard, more grey than brown now, hung unkempt around a jaw that rarely worked except to chew tobacco or mutter prayers. He wasn't sure anyone heard anymore. The nearest neighbor lived a hard day's ride to the east, and the closest town, Redemption Creek, lay 3 days south through country that could kill a man in a dozen different ways. Ezra preferred it that way. Out here, a man could think, could remember, could forget. The silence was his companion, broken only by the wind through the mesquite and the occasional lowing of the handful of cattle he kept penned behind the cabin. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Moses, stood in the small corral Ezra had fashioned from fallen timber and rusted wire. Moses was getting on in years, same as his master, but they understood each other in the way that lonely creatures do. The horse's ribs showed through his coat, not from neglect but from the hard living that defined everything in this unforgiving land. Ezra's daily routine had worn grooves as deep as wagon ruts. Rise before dawn, tend to Moses and the cattle, check the sparse vegetable garden he'd coaxed from the stubborn soil, mend whatever the elements had broken overnight, and spend the long afternoon hours sitting on his porch, watching the horizon shimmer in the heat. Evenings brought the simple ritual of beans and hardtack, maybe a strip of jerky if he'd been lucky hunting. This particular day had started no different from the hundreds that came before it. The morning brought its usual chorus of complaints from his creaking joints as he hauled water from the well, fed Moses his meager portion of oats, and checked the fence line where coyotes had been testing his defenses. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day that would leach what little moisture remained from the earth. It was near noon when Ezra first noticed the dust cloud on the northern horizon. In this country, dust meant riders, and riders meant trouble more often than not. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in his early years out here. Claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, and worse had taught him to keep his Winchester loaded and close at hand. But this dust was different somehow, moving erratic-like, not with the purposeful direction of men with ill intent. Ezra shaded his eyes with a weathered hand and squinted into the distance. The cloud seemed to waver, stopping and starting again, as if whoever was raising it couldn't decide which way to go. Hours passed, and the dust grew closer. By mid-afternoon, Ezra could make out the dark speck of a single rider, weaving unsteadily across the prairie. The horse moved with the labored gait of an animal pushed beyond endurance, and even from a distance Ezra could see something was amiss. As the rider drew nearer, the truth became clear. The man slumped forward in his saddle, barely clinging to consciousness. His horse, a magnificent black stallion that had seen better days, stumbled with each step. Blood had dried dark on the stranger's shirt, and his left arm hung useless at his side. Ezra stepped down from his porch, rifle in hand, but pointed toward the ground. In this country, caution kept a man breathing, but so did knowing when to show mercy. The stranger's horse came to a halt 20 yards from the cabin, its sides heaving like bellows. The rider swayed, then toppled from the saddle, hitting the hard ground with a sound that made Ezra wince. "Mister," Ezra called out, approaching slowly. "You alive?" The stranger stirred, lifting his head with tremendous effort. He was younger than Ezra, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. His clothes, what Ezra could see through the grime and blood, had once been fine quality, the kind a man of means might wear. A silver watch chain glinted from his vest pocket, and his boots, though scuffed, were made of good leather. "Water," the stranger croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezra set his rifle aside and knelt beside the fallen man. Up close, he could see the extent of the injuries. A bullet had torn through the stranger's shoulder, and another had creased his ribs. Loss of blood had left his face pale as prairie bones. "Easy there, friend," Ezra said, supporting the stranger's head. "Let me get you inside." The task of moving the wounded man proved harder than Ezra expected. The stranger was dead weight, mumbling incoherently as Ezra half carried, half dragged him toward the cabin. By the time they reached the door, both men were breathing hard, and fresh blood seeped through the stranger's shirt. Inside the dim cabin, Ezra cleared his narrow cot and eased the stranger down onto the straw mattress. The man's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Ezra's weathered face. "Indians," the stranger whispered. "Apaches. They got the others." Ezra nodded grimly. Apache raiding parties had been active in the territory lately, striking at wagon trains and isolated settlements before melting back into the desert like smoke. This man was lucky to be alive, though looking at his wounds that luck might not hold much longer. "How many others?" Ezra asked, fetching a basin of water and clean rags. "5 of us," the stranger said, wincing as Ezra began cleaning the wounds. "Heading to California, I'm—" He paused, as if deciding whether to trust this solitary cowboy with his identity. "Name's Jonathan Whitmore, from back east." The name meant nothing to Ezra, but the man's accent and expensive gear told a story. Eastern money, probably heading west for business or maybe running from some kind of trouble. Out here, a man's past was his own business, so Ezra didn't press for details. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, you're in a bad way," Ezra said, examining the shoulder wound. "Bullet's still in there and you've lost considerable blood. I ain't no doctor, but I've patched up enough men to know what needs doing." Over the next several hours, Ezra worked with the methodical care of a man who'd tended battlefield wounds during the war. He heated his skinning knife over the fire until it glowed red, then used it to dig the bullet from Whitmore's shoulder, while the injured man bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The second wound, thankfully, was just a graze that cleaned up easier. As evening approached, Ezra prepared a thin broth from his precious supply of beef jerky and wild onions. Whitmore had drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day, but the fever that had burned in him seemed to be breaking. "Why?" Whitmore asked suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been hours earlier. "Why are you helping me?" Ezra considered the question while ladling broth into a battered tin cup. It was a fair question. Out here, strangers meant danger more often than not, and taking in a wounded man was asking for trouble. If those Apaches tracked Whitmore to the cabin, they'd both be dead by morning. "Man needs help, you help him," Ezra said finally. "Way I was raised." "But you don't know me. I could be an outlaw, a murderer." "Could be," Ezra agreed, helping Whitmore sit up to drink the broth. "But you ain't acting like one. And even if you were, ain't my place to judge. That's between you and the Almighty." Whitmore drank slowly, color gradually returning to his pale cheeks. "There aren't many men like you left in this world, Mr. Coleman, Ezra Coleman. Mr. Coleman, I want you to know that what you've done today, taking me in like this, it means more than you know. I'm not a man accustomed to charity, but I recognize kindness when I see it." As the night deepened, Ezra made himself a bedroll on the floor, insisting that Whitmore keep the cot. The stranger protested, but Ezra wouldn't hear of it. Through the long hours of darkness, Ezra dozed fitfully, alert for any sounds that might indicate trouble approaching. Whitmore's fever broke completely sometime before dawn, and when the first light crept through the cabin's single window, he was sitting up, looking much improved despite his bandaged wounds. "I should be moving on," Whitmore said, as Ezra prepared a breakfast of cornbread and coffee. "Those Apaches might still be tracking me, and I've put you in enough danger already." "You ain't in any shape to travel," Ezra replied. "Give it another day or two." But Whitmore shook his head. "I appreciate everything you've done, Mr. Coleman, more than I can say, but I won't risk your life any further for my sake." After breakfast, Ezra helped Whitmore to his feet and out to where the black stallion stood. The horse had recovered somewhat from its ordeal, but it would be a hard journey wherever Whitmore was headed. "Take some supplies," Ezra offered, gathering what little food he could spare. "I can't take your provisions," Whitmore protested. "You've already given too much." "Ain't given nothing I can't spare," Ezra lied. Truth was, those supplies would leave him mighty short for the weeks ahead, but something about this stranger compelled him to generosity. As Whitmore prepared to mount his horse, he turned to Ezra with an expression of profound gratitude. "Mr. Coleman, I want you to remember this day. What you've done here, this act of mercy, it matters more than you can possibly know." There was something in the man's eyes, a strange intensity that made Ezra uncomfortable, but he nodded and stepped back as Whitmore climbed carefully into the saddle, favoring his wounded shoulder. "You take care of yourself out there," Ezra said, "and you do the same, Mr. Coleman. I have a feeling our paths will cross again." With that, Jonathan Whitmore rode away toward the south, disappearing eventually into the shimmering heat haze that danced above the prairie. Ezra watched until the last trace of dust settled, then returned to his cabin with the strange feeling that something important had just occurred, though he couldn't rightly say what. The remainder of that day passed quietly. Ezra tended to his usual chores, but his mind kept returning to the mysterious stranger. There had been something different about Whitmore, something that didn't quite fit with his story of being a businessman traveling to California. The way he'd spoken, the odd intensity in his final words, left Ezra with questions he couldn't answer. That evening, as Ezra sat on his porch watching the sun set over the endless expanse of prairie, he reflected on what he'd done. Giving shelter to a wounded stranger was just common decency, the way any Christian man should behave. But it had cost him supplies he could ill afford to lose, and for all he knew, he'd aided a man who might be running from justice. Still, as he'd told Whitmore, judging others wasn't his place. Every man deserved a chance at mercy, even if he didn't deserve it. Ezra's own past wasn't without its dark corners, and he'd been grateful for the second chances life had given him out here in the wilderness. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ezra made his way inside and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he'd need his rest. He had no way of knowing that the next dawn would bring changes that would transform his solitary existence forever, that his simple act of kindness would be repaid in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning broke clear and still, with not even a whisper of wind to stir the dust around Ezra's cabin. He woke before sunrise, as was his custom, and stepped outside to begin his daily routine. But something felt different, though he couldn't rightly put his finger on what it was. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole prairie was waiting for something to happen. Ezra shook off the strange feeling and walked to the well to draw water for Moses. As he worked the rusty pump handle, a sound reached his ears that made him pause. It was distant, barely audible but unmistakable to a man who'd spent his life on the frontier. The rhythmic thunder of many horses moving at a steady pace, still miles away but growing closer. He straightened, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the well post. A large group of riders approaching his isolated homestead could mean only trouble. In his 7 years out here, he'd never seen more than 3 or 4 men traveling together, and those had usually been outlaws or cavalry patrols. The sound grew steadily louder as Ezra went about his morning chores with increasing unease. Moses sensed his master's tension and paced restlessly in the corral, ears pricked forward toward the approaching thunder. The cattle lowed nervously, bunching together in the far corner of their pen. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon, the sound had become unmistakable. Horses, dozens of them, maybe more, coming from the north, the same direction Jonathan Whitmore had appeared from the day before. Ezra's stomach tightened as he considered the possibility that those Apache raiders had tracked the wounded stranger to his cabin and were now coming to finish what they'd started. He loaded his Winchester and took position behind the water trough, using it as cover while he scanned the northern horizon. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. A dust cloud stretched across the prairie like a brown curtain, wider than any he'd ever seen. Whatever was coming toward him was bigger than any raiding party or cavalry patrol. As the riders drew closer, details began to emerge from the haze. These weren't Apache warriors painted for battle, nor were they blue-coated soldiers. Instead, Ezra saw men dressed in the rough work clothes of cowboys, miners, and frontiersmen. Some rode alone, others in small groups, but all seemed to be heading directly toward his homestead with purposeful determination. The first riders crested the small rise that lay a quarter-mile north of Ezra's cabin, and what he saw defied all reason. Men on horseback stretched as far as he could see, a river of humanity flowing across the empty prairie like nothing he'd witnessed in all his years on the frontier. They came in waves, groups of 10 and 20, some leading pack animals loaded with supplies, others driving wagons filled with tools and timber. Ezra lowered his rifle, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. These men weren't coming to attack him. They were coming to build something. The lead rider, a grizzled man with silver hair and a magnificent sorrel horse, raised his hand and called out as he approached. "You Ezra Coleman?" "I am," Ezra replied, his voice hoarse with amazement. "Who's asking?" "Name's Captain Marcus Sullivan, formerly of the Texas Rangers," the man said, dismounting and walking forward with his hand extended. "We're here on account of what you did yesterday." "What I did?" Ezra echoed, accepting the handshake while trying to make sense of what was happening. Behind Sullivan, more riders continued to arrive, filling the space around his cabin like water flooding a dry creek bed. "For Jonathan Whitmore," Sullivan explained. "Word travels fast out here, Mr. Coleman, faster than you might think. That man you helped, he's got friends, lots of them. And when word reached us about what you did, taking him in when he was shot up and bleeding, giving him your last supplies when you barely got enough for yourself, well, we decided something needed to be done about that." More men dismounted and began unloading wagons with practiced efficiency. Ezra watched in stunned silence as lumber, tools, nails, rope, and provisions appeared as if by magic. Some of the men began surveying his property, measuring distances and marking locations with wooden stakes. "I don't understand," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's all this about?" A younger man with the calloused hands of a carpenter stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman, my name's Samuel Hughes. I build things for a living, and I'm here to build you something special. We all are." "Build me what?" "A fortress," Hughes said simply. "A real home. Something worthy of a man who'd give his last crust of bread to a stranger." As if responding to some unspoken signal, the assembled men began to work. Ezra had never seen anything like it. They moved with the coordination of a military unit, but the enthusiasm of men working for a cause they believed in. Some began clearing and leveling ground, others started sawing lumber, and still others began digging post holes for what would clearly be a structure far larger than anything Ezra had ever imagined. "This ain't right," Ezra protested, but his words were lost in the sound of hammers and saws. "I can't accept this. I don't deserve—" "Mr. Coleman," Sullivan interrupted, placing a firm hand on Ezra's shoulder. "Every man deserves kindness, but precious few earn it the way you did. Jonathan Whitmore is a special man, though I reckon you figured that out already. He's got a way of knowing people, understanding their true nature. When he rode into our camp yesterday evening and told us what you'd done, how you'd risked your own life and given your last supplies to help him, well, there wasn't a man among us who didn't want to be part of repaying that debt." "But there's so many of you," Ezra said, watching as more riders continued to arrive. "Must be hundreds. 512 to be exact," Sullivan said with a grin. "Men from all over the territory, cowboys, miners, merchants, even a few preachers. Word spread through the settlements like wildfire. Every man who ever received help from a stranger, every soul who understands what it means to be alone and desperate, they all wanted to be here today." The scale of the operation was staggering. Teams of men worked on different aspects of the construction simultaneously. Foundation stones were being laid for what looked like it would be a substantial house, while others erected the framework for outbuildings. A group of experienced well diggers had started work on deepening Ezra's existing well, and others were stringing wire for an expanded corral system. "Where'd all this lumber come from?" Ezra asked, watching as pre-cut beams were unloaded from wagon after wagon. "Donated," Hughes explained, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his brow. "Mill owner in Redemption Creek heard the story and sent everything we needed. Nails came from the hardware store, tools from a dozen different sources. Every man here brought something to contribute." As the morning progressed, the outline of Ezra's new home began to take shape. It would be a proper house, not a cabin, with multiple rooms, real windows, and a stone fireplace. The main structure was being built of solid timber, designed to withstand anything the frontier could throw at it. But more than just a house, they were building him a complete homestead. The old corral was being expanded into a proper stable with stalls for multiple horses. A new barn was rising from the prairie, large enough to store hay and equipment for a real ranching operation. They were even building a smokehouse and a root cellar, luxuries Ezra had never dreamed of possessing. "This is too much," Ezra said repeatedly, but no one would listen to his protests. The men worked with a joy and purpose that was infectious. Laughter echoed across the construction site as stories were shared and friendships formed. This wasn't just a building project, it was a celebration of human kindness and community spirit. By midday, the framework of the main house was complete, and the walls were beginning to take shape. A team of roofers had arrived with slate tiles, a luxury that would make Ezra's new home the finest dwelling for 100 miles in any direction. Others were installing glass windows, actual glass, not the oiled paper he'd been making do with for years. During a brief break in the work, Sullivan approached Ezra again. "You're probably wondering how this is possible, how word spread so fast, how we got organized so quick." Ezra nodded, still overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. "Jonathan Whitmore isn't just any traveler," Sullivan explained. "He's got connections throughout the territory, friends in every settlement. When he rides into a place, people listen. He told us about your kindness, about how you shared your last provisions with a stranger, and it reminded every man here of times when they needed help themselves." "But this must be costing a fortune," Ezra protested. "Sometimes the most important things can't be measured in dollars," Sullivan replied. "Besides, most of these men owe Whitmore favors from over the years. He's helped more folks than you can count, and when he called in those favors for your sake, well, here we are." As the afternoon wore on, the transformation of Ezra's homestead became even more remarkable. The main house was nearly complete, with a wraparound porch and decorative trim that made it look like something from an eastern city rather than a frontier dwelling. The barn was finished and already stocked with hay and feed that had appeared from nowhere, but the most incredible sight was yet to come. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Ezra noticed men working on something beyond the main buildings. They were constructing what looked like defensive walls, complete with watchtowers and firing positions. "You're building me a fort," Ezra said to Hughes, who was putting finishing touches on the front door of the new house. "That's the idea," Hughes confirmed. "This country's still dangerous, Mr. Coleman. Apache raids, outlaw gangs, claim jumpers. A man needs protection, especially a man who's shown he's worth protecting." The defensive walls were being built of stone and timber, designed to withstand assault while providing comfortable living within. Gun ports were positioned at strategic intervals, and the watchtowers offered commanding views of the surrounding prairie. It was indeed a fortress, but one built with love and respect rather than fear and paranoia. As evening approached, the work began to wind down. The transformation was complete, and Ezra's modest homestead had become something out of a fairy tale. The main house stood solid and proud, surrounded by outbuildings that would have been the envy of any rancher in the territory. The defensive walls enclosed the entire compound, creating a secure haven in the midst of the dangerous frontier. "How can I ever repay this?" Ezra asked Sullivan as the men began to pack their tools. "You already have," Sullivan replied, "by showing kindness to a stranger when it cost you everything you had. That's payment enough for any man here." As the 512 men prepared to depart, each one stopped to shake Ezra's hand and wish him well. Some offered additional gifts: a fine saddle, a set of silver spurs, a hand-carved rifle stock. Others simply expressed their gratitude for reminding them what true generosity looked like. The last man to leave was a grizzled old prospector who pressed something into Ezra's palm. "Found this up in the mountains," he said gruffly. "Figured you might like it." Ezra looked down to see a small gold nugget, worth more than he'd ever possessed in his life. Before he could protest, the old man had mounted his mule and ridden away into the gathering darkness. As silence finally returned to the prairie, Ezra stood alone in the doorway of his magnificent new home, trying to comprehend what had happened. In a single day, his entire life had been transformed. The lonely cowboy who had gone to bed the night before in a leaking cabin was now the master of a fortress that would have impressed a king. But more than the physical transformation, something had changed inside Ezra himself. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The knowledge that 500 men had traveled from across the territory to honor his simple act of kindness filled him with a warmth that no fireplace could match. As he explored his new home that night, lighting the oil lamps that had been installed in every room, Ezra found a note on the kitchen table. It was written in the familiar hand of Jonathan Whitmore. "Mr. Coleman, what you see around you is not a reward for your kindness, but a reflection of it. You opened your heart to a stranger, and in doing so you opened the hearts of everyone who heard your story. This fortress is not just built of stone and timber, but of human gratitude and respect. May it stand as long as men remember what it means to help one another. Your friend always, Jonathan Whitmore." Ezra read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. As he prepared for bed in his new home, surrounded by walls that represented the collective gratitude of 500 strangers who had become friends, he finally understood the true meaning of what had happened. His simple act of mercy had rippled outward like stones thrown in still water, touching lives across the territory and inspiring a demonstration of human goodness unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. The fortress around him stood as proof that kindness, once given freely, returns multiplied beyond all expectation.